I was wondering if I could ask you all in the back if it would not be an inconvenience if you could move forward so that I don't have this weird optic of being middle. Okay, thank you. Jai Janendra, thank you very much for having me, and I'm grateful to Sushil, Jane, and all of the people who organized this conference and who invited me. I'm grateful. And let me say from the outset, Michami Lukadam, I don't mean, I'm going to be talking about veganism, and I'm going to be asking you to consider that as a necessary part of Ahimsa. To the extent that you may not be vegan now, I do not want you to take this or to understand this as any sort of personal criticism or condemnation or anything like that, because it's not. That's not how I intend it. I am intending it only to be something to stimulate you, to provoke you into thinking about what Ahimsa means to you. And I want to offer some ideas. If there is time, it's a smaller group. If there's time at the end, I'll be happy to take your questions. And then there's going to be a panel afterward, after this session ends. There will be a panel afterward in which Saurabh and Dr. Gina Shah will join me, and we will be talking about the ethical, the health, and the environmental aspects of ahimsic diet, and which is another word for a vegan diet. You know, it's funny, vegan is a word which for a lot of Jain people I think has a negative connotation, because it's associated with the Western concept of animal rights, and it's associated with ideas which may be considered sort of peculiar and idiosyncratically Western and not part of Jain thinking. And so, in a sense, the word itself almost is alienating. But let's get beyond those connotations and think a little bit about the concept. I want to share with you a little bit about how I got to this point, because I never thought growing up that I would be anything but a meat-eating person that I started off being, because that's what I was. I mean, I was raised in the traditional Western Christian tradition, and we consumed a lot of meat all the time. As a matter of fact, it was a regular meat and dairy were regular parts of every meal that we had, and it was only during a particular time of the year, which is called Lent, which is right before Easter, where you wouldn't eat meat on Fridays, you would have fish instead, as if fish matter less than cows or whatever. But that was the culture in which I grew up, and during the late 60s and 70s, I was part of the peace movement, and we were all opposing the Vietnam War. And during that time, we started hearing about nonviolence, because Dr. King talked about nonviolence, and Dr. King talked about Gandhi and nonviolence. And we knew vaguely who Gandhi was, but we'd heard about it in history class, but we didn't know very much about Gandhi. He did not figure very, very heavily in American culture, because he was important in terms of Indian history. He was important in terms of the relationship of Britain and India. But we knew about him, but didn't know much about him. But we started hearing about him from Dr. King, and we started thinking about nonviolence. So we started thinking, hey, this is a cool idea, nonviolence. It sort of fits with our opposition to the war and that sort of thing. And this really fits. It's good. But it was an abstract concept for me. Nonviolence was a totally abstract concept. It was a word, nonviolence. We didn't say ahimsa. We said nonviolence. It was a word. It was a concept. It meant nothing in many ways, except it fit with our opposition to the war, which made it convenient. It was in 1978 that I started understanding what ahimsa meant. I went to a slaughterhouse. I had never been to a slaughterhouse. Most people never go to slaughterhouses. I had been, and someone challenged me and said, "You eat meat, you believe in nonviolence, you should go to a slaughterhouse." So I did. I went to a slaughterhouse outside of Richmond, Virginia. I was in law school. I went to law school and graduate school at the University of Virginia. And so I went to a slaughterhouse. And it was a horrifying, horrifying, horrifying experience. Absolutely one of the most, well, it was up to that point in my life, it was the most horrifying experience I had ever had. And I've been in many slaughterhouses since, because I then got involved with this, and I've written a lot about it, and I've been probably to maybe as many as 30 slaughterhouses in my life. And I still, when I'm in periods of stress and I have nightmares, I still have nightmares about that first slaughterhouse that I went to. It was a veal slaughterhouse. Veal. And that's relevant for something I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes, the relationship between the veal industry and the dairy industry. But I went to a veal slaughterhouse. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit into the mic? We can't hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I apologize. And so I went to a veal slaughterhouse. And the way veal calves are raised, they're raised in these little tiny crates. And so that their muscles don't develop. And so they can't walk. So that when they take them to slaughter at about 6 months of age, most of them can't walk, they're dragged. And those that can't drag, they're kicked, or they use electric prods and things like that. And under American law, you're supposed to stun them so that they can't feel anything when they're actually shackled and hoisted. But that doesn't work very well. Because in order to stun an animal, to keep an animal completely unconscious during the slaughtering process, you have to apply the electric prongs. You have to do it properly, and what happens with a lot of these animals is they're hanging there upside down, and they're starting to be conscious as people are cutting in. It's really quite horrible. But it's the whole process was horrible, and I walked out of there a different person, actually a different person. I walked out and I thought, you know what? I'm talking about nonviolence, but violence is a part of my life. Every time I get up in the morning, I'm sticking it in my mouth. It's part of who I am. I mean, violence is a part of my life, and I can't do this anymore. That was in 1978. I walked out of that slaughterhouse. I have not eaten a piece of meat since that time. I mean, it wasn't a graduate. It was like I walked out, and and then I started thinking about what nonviolence meant, because now it was starting to become personal. Now it was starting to become something that was more than just some abstract idea. It was now starting to become part of my life. And so I started thinking about what nonviolence meant, because I wanted to understand, why did I think, it wasn't just that it was bloody and horrible, it wasn't just that. Yeah, it was that, there was a lot of that involved. But it was the violence was repulsive. It didn't matter that it was gory, that there was a lot of blood and stuff. It was, the violence was repulsive to me. And I was trying to understand, why is that? Why is that? And so I started studying more about nonviolence. And that's when I encountered Jainism. I knew nothing about Jainism. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And you know, I mean, I had heard about Jainism, and I had, as most Western people, I had silly stereotypes. You know, the Jains are the people who walked around with the mopatis and they sweet bread. And you know, I knew nothing about Jainism. And so I started reading, and there wasn't, at the time, we're talking 1978, 79, there wasn't a great deal of literature written in English that was good. You know, that was coherent. There was some stuff, and some of it wasn't very good. But I read what I could. And I encountered Mahavir and all this, the ideas of nonviolence and ahimsa. And ahimsa, you know, ahimsa paramo dharma, ahimsa is the principle. And I thought, this is just wonderful. But you know, I continued to eat dairy, to consume dairy. Because I thought, you know, first of all, I didn't know, and I really mean it, I didn't know you could live a healthy life without eating dairy. Now I realize that eating dairy will probably hasten your death. But at the time, I bought into the propaganda that you needed to eat milk and cheese and things like that in order to get protein, particularly if you didn't eat meat. You have to, you know, again, it's going back a number of years. As a matter of fact, I remember when I told my mother I was going to become, I told my mother I'd become a vegetarian in 1978. She cried. And she said, "You're going to die." And I said, no, I said, "I'll be fine, you know." And she was like upset, and you know, she had like my aunts calling me up, and she had people calling me saying, please eat meat, you know, we don't want you to die, you're going to die if you don't eat meat, and so I'll be fine. And so, but I didn't know about veganism. I had never even heard the word vegan. I had never heard the word vegan. So it was 1982, and I had a conversation with a friend who was a vegan, and who said to me, you know, there's no difference between dairy and meat. And she gave me a book. It was a book that had just been published in England. And she gave it to me. I read it. That was a Saturday in, I don't remember whether it was October or November of 1982, but it was in one of those months, and it was on a Saturday I read the book. I put the book down, and I have not eaten a dairy product since that time. So again, it wasn't a gradual thing. It was, if you take, you know, if you really take the idea seriously and you come to the conclusion that you're doing, you know, something that you can't justify, then you either need to change your moral principles or you need to change your behavior. So I stopped, and stopped dead. That was it. So since that October or November Saturday of 1982, I haven't had any animal products whatsoever, and I stopped. I still had leather and wool clothes that I already had, and I continued to wear them until they wore out. And then I stopped buying leather, and I stopped buying wool, and I stopped buying silk ties and things like that. You know, I stopped buying all that stuff, got rid of all that stuff. Let's take a look at my notes here to make sure I'm making my points. I make these notes and I don't pay any attention to them. Because I have it all like sort of mapped out, and then I.
What was the book, Gary?
The book was actually, Sora, funny you should ask. The book was called Fettered Kingdoms, and it was written by a man named John Bryant in England. And I was very impressed by this book. And as I say, it made me vegan. Years later, I met him in London, and I told him, I said, I want to thank you because it was a result of reading your book that I went vegan. And he said, well, I'm actually a little embarrassed. And I said, why? And he said, because I'm not vegan anymore. And I said, you're not? And he said, no. He said, I find it too difficult. I travel a lot in Britain. He travels a lot, and he finds it hard to be vegan in Britain. And I said, if you find it hard to be vegan in Britain, then you're not trying hard enough. But in any event, he recently wrote to me. He's now in his 70s, and he recently wrote an email to me saying that he was moving again toward veganism. And I said, well, better late than never, and I hope you make the journey.